So I'm Dan. I'll have a slide that says that in a second. But there are a whole lot of people in this room, hopefully few enough to where we can have a conversation rather than making this kind of a ridiculous tutorial. Who here has done anything with web components before? Okay, so maybe about a quarter of the room. Why are the rest of you here? Someone, anyone? To figure it out, right? All right, so you may have heard things that web components are cool, they're a new thing, they're hot, they're gonna make life easier for everyone. The answer is maybe. So my name's Dan. I work for Mozilla. We make Firefox. It's a good browser. You should try it. It's open source. We don't charge money for it. We don't track you and charge other people money for that data either. So like everything's on the up and up. And what I want to talk about today is web components, which are a suite of standards that are designed to give new primitives to the browser so that you can have a more reusable and composable web, right? In the family of web components, there are 4 standards: templates, HTML imports, custom elements, shadow DOM. Is anyone in the room pedantic and snarky and wanting to yell at me about something on here? All right, good. So it turns out templates have graduated out of web components and they're now part of the HTML5 living standard. So now we're just down to 3. And of those 3, HTML imports, Mozilla has decided that we will not ship, period. We think it's not a spec that's ready. We think that ES6 module loading is going to change the way we look at importing and dependency management and things like that. And we want to see, this is polyfillable, we want to see like what people create once browsers get ES6 module loaders in them, and we see what happens there. So we're not going to ship that, which leaves us with 2. So we've got custom element and shadow DOM. And custom element is pretty cool, and like everyone likes that. Shadow DOM people seem to really like, but independently at Mozilla, we've also had a couple of projects that are like, yeah, shadow DOM's great, but we're probably not going to use it. So what's interesting is you can go to this website, Are We Componentized Yet? And you get this nice, really green grid that makes you think like everything is happy and good in the components world. Everything is spec'd. There are polyfills available for everything. Chrome has shipped everything. And that's kind of it. The template tag is in Safari, it's in Chrome, it's available. Template tag's good. HTML imports, Mozilla's raised objections to. We have custom elements and shadow DOMs behind flags in the browser. So they're not available, and the spec itself is still, I gave this talk a year ago, the spec is drastically changing. Like last week, a very core idea of like, can you write a style sheet that goes into the shadow DOM, got pulled out. So I mean, very, very fundamental things are being changed. Of course, Safari and IE aren't at this party yet. So everything I'm going to tell you today is not production ready. Like none of this, if you are here to get something extremely practical out of this talk, like this is not the talk. What I want to do instead is talk about these 4 specs from the perspective of one possible future for the web. Google's decided to go ahead and ship unprefixed, which has forced a lot of discussion and a lot of drama. It's created a lot of drama. It's been good. But there's clearly interest in getting here. So what do these things actually let you do? I'm going to start by creating a blink tag because the web is missing that. It had it and it's gone. And so can everyone read the code on the right? Font big enough, color's good. All right. So this document will kind of encapsulate everything that web components are. And then by the end of this, hopefully you'll be able to understand what it's doing. So I've got a link rel import. So I've got an HTML import for xblink.html. And then down in my body, I've got an h1. And inside I've got xblink hello world. And then a paragraph, aren't you xblink happy that I made this? So if we go and load that up, I'm going to be using Chrome again because they're shipping unprefixed. Most of Firefox's implementation is there. We've been waiting for some of the spec stuff to fall out in terms of, all right, how does styling work? How are imports going to get resolved before we actually implement? So you'll see me, the Mozilla guy, using Chrome. I apologize. So that markup gives you a blink tag, right? Like this is what the web has been missing for at least 3 years since it got ripped out of all the browsers unceremoniously. So how'd this work? Like I imported xblink.html, but what's inside that? And this is where the meat of the web component stuff comes through. I've got a template tag with ID xblink template. I've got a style block where I've defined a CSS3 animation that starts with opacity 1, goes to 0, goes back to 1. And then I'm using the host pseudo selector and saying, all right, I want to use the blink animation. I want it to loop every 1 second using this kind of animation function. Start at 0 seconds and repeat infinitely. The host pseudo selector is something that comes in Shadow DOM. When I talk about the specs not being finalized, that may be going away. So like very fundamental things of like how do I style content inside my Shadow DOM? Who knows? The specs are crazy town. And then anyways, at the end of this template, I've got this content block. I've also got a script. And the script says, all right, when this runs, look up document current script owner document, which is the page that we're in, that this stuff is in. Assign template to this document's get element by ID xblink template. We'll create a prototype. We'll give it an attached callback. And whenever we insert this into the DOM, or whenever we see this in the DOM, we're going to create a shadow root on our xblink tag, and we're going to append the content of the template into that thing. Lastly, we're going to define our xblink tag and give it this prototype we defined, deriving from HTML element. Again, you're not expected to understand this yet. We'll go through each of these things individually, but that code lets us do this. And what's interesting is, you see here in this template a style tag, this content tag, etc. If we go into Chrome, well, if you look at our markup, like the style tag doesn't show up anywhere in here, but it's part of our template. So if we go into Chrome, we inspect element and attach this to the browser and make it way bigger. So we go and look in the body, look at H1, we see the xblink tag, and we can see our text just like we wrote it, but there's also this shadow root that has our style tag, has our content tag, which has our text. So anyways, blink tag. First 5 minutes, we're happy. We did something good for the web, right? Like you can leave this talk knowing that you made the web a happier, blinkier place, which who else misses marquee? Does anyone else miss the marquee tag? All right, we're not going to do that, but you could. You could do the same thing. So let's go back to Firefox, go back to the presentation. Let's talk about templates. The idea behind the template tag is that it's a place to put HTML that you don't want the browser to mess with.
Would you mind obscuring your brilliant blink tag?
I would mind, thank you very much. Here, we'll put this over here. All right. So front-end JavaScript, like you've got handlebars, you've got other things. Like when you need a template, what do? Anyone?
And the script tag.
Script tag, and what do you do with that script tag?
What do you mean?
Well, also like normally when you do a script tag, you like type text equals JavaScript or whatever, right?
It's like X handlebars or something.
Right, and so you put a script tag in the document and you give it a MIME type that doesn't match JavaScript, and so the browser doesn't try to do anything with it. They use these huge hacks to get the inner text of that script node, and then you try to parse the text, and super nuts. It's clear that if we're moving more and more of our templating to the front end, with things like Ember, Angular, etc., we need an ability to have like sets of DOM nodes that are not active that we can take and we can stamp out. So let's do a demo with this. Let's look at template v1. So really simple document. We load it. We've got an image tag and a script that's just going to alert hi. So if I go and navigate to that, template v1, I get that, and the image breaks because there is no actual image. But you can see the network request, right? It tries to get invalid.png, and it doesn't work because it's not there. If I take that and I wrap it in a template tag, the script shouldn't run. So if I go to v2, you can see that down here, we didn't request the image, we didn't run the script. So just by wrapping this set of code, this set of markup in a template tag, we've completely rendered it inert, which is super useful if you want to be able to clone this and repeat it a lot of times. Like say you're building the next Groove Shark because, piracy is good. And it's a great business model for like 5 years. You might want to be able to have templates for like, here's an entry in my playlist. And that's going to have some buttons with some JavaScript attached to it. It's going to have an image, whatever. You put in a template tag, and then like nothing in this runs, but we can still get at it. So if I look at this source, you look inside the template, you can see the document fragment. If I pull up the split console, if I try to actually select things that have the class foo, so like document.querySelector all.foo, we don't find anything, again, because these are hidden from the DOM. They're in a document fragment as part of the template tag, completely inert. But I can select get element by ID. I can select that template tag, and that has an attribute called content, which is the document fragment, which has our stuff in it. And this is actually parsed DOM, so I can go in here and I can say, shoot, they've already implemented that. So like last week, I'm not kidding at all. So last week, you'll notice that like I don't have get element by class name or anything like that, or get elements by class name. Those got ripped out of the standard. So the way you get in here, you have get element by ID. Do you have query selector? Yeah, you still have query selector. So I can get at my .foo things inside the template. And what's interesting is like these are actual DOM. Pardon?
You're saying they took away something you wanted, or what?
Yeah, so what I wanted to be able to do is say x.content, which gets into my template content, and I wanted to be able to say get elements by class name.
Oh, I see.
So like you can do document dot get elements by class name, but that's no longer available inside Shadow DOM.
Okay.
This, I mean, literally last week. So what I'm showing you, don't worry too much about the actual code, but try to think more about what these things are enabling.
New question then. So it's called the Shadow DOM because it's not part of the actively mess with stuff by the browser.
Sorry, I misspoke. Document fragments are different than Shadow DOM. Same removal happened in both. We'll get to the Shadow DOM. Yeah, it's removed from the normal parse tree or the normal render tree. So anyway, so I can go in here and I can say, all right, x.content.clone node, and I'll do a deep clone. And I get that document fragment. So I can instead say like document, or we'll save that to document. Also, is that text too low for people in the back? Can you see what I'm typing? A little bit low? All right, hang on. There we go. All right, so I can say document.body.appendChild x.content clone node true. So what this is going to do is it's going to clone my template, like all the parse DOM, and it's going to append it to the body of my document. So when I do this, the script runs, and we can see over here, oh, it's in the console, that it tried to fetch the image. Do it again, same thing happens. Right, so again, this gives you the idea that you've got parsed HTML, so you can actually navigate this like you would expect to with query selector, with get element by ID. But until you actually append it to something that's part of your document, it's not active. Things don't download, things don't run. So super good place to put like your handlebars templates and things like that. What we would expect is once this gets more broad support natively in browsers, you'd expect things like handlebars to be like, no, just write a template, give it class handlebars, and then they can worry about doing all the injecting of content and like expanding of variables, and let the browser itself handle the actual parsing of the HTML. So kind of cool there, right? Does everyone kind of grok what's going on there?
Grok it? No.
No, well, nobody's going to grok this. Everything changes. So anyways, template tag gives you the ability to create completely inert, parsed, and contained HTML for reuse later.
Can you add placeholders to that template so like you remember the content?
Yeah, totally. And like you can modify it just like you would modify any other markup, like .append child, .inner HTML, whatever. Shadow DOM actually gives you some ability to do that natively in the browser, which is kind of cool. And we'll get to that in a second. The second thing we talked about, HTML imports, which is this kind of nobody wants it. Everyone wants it, except the browser vendors. The idea is that you can load external HTML just like you load CSS or JavaScript. So we saw that in the XBlink example.
Google likes it. Chrome doesn't.
Yeah, they're also actually kind of stepping back a little bit because there's some confusion as to. So when you do a link rel import, when you do an HTML import, it's non-blocking. Which, if you do a bunch of these, there's a lot of questions as to like, what's the resolution order of this stuff? And a whole lot of complication happens there. So we'll get there. There are polyfills for all this stuff. But one example of where import could be useful, and so by the way, everything I'm doing in Chrome, I'm doing because Chrome has native support for this. As the spec stands right now, the spec is likely to change. If you want to do this for yourself, you'll probably end up using a library like Polymer, which will abstract away a lot of the stuff. And Polymer has a polyfill called webcomponents.js that has broad support for everything except IE10. So the idea is like you could actually go and use this stuff today. I would recommend against using it raw, just because what that means is very, very fluctuating, very, very volatile. But I didn't want to have the indirection layer of like, let me tell you about polyfills. So let's look at Bootstrap. So when you set up a Bootstrap site, one of the things they tell you to do is to, include the CSS, and then at the end of your body include jQuery, and then after jQuery include the Bootstrap JavaScript, right? And this is super rough because you've got to modify things at the top and at the bottom of your document. You have to make sure the ordering is right. And if you do that, it works. So we go over here, like we have the Bootstrap nice styling. But what HTML imports would let us do is actually replace that link line and these two script lines with like a single call to go and import bootstrap.html, right? And bootstrap.html can have the link tag, the two script tags. It can have other things. It can have script tags that execute stuff. So if we go to this v2 and look in the console, we should have seen, oh, right, we define a function. So the interesting thing is like when these get pulled in, so I'm doing an import bootstrap.html, and inside here I'm declaring a function foo. That's actually visible to the external document scope. So these aren't necessarily like scripts that execute inside that HTML import, are executing with the context of the document that requested them, which is again another source of like crazy complexity. This is kind of one of the reasons that Mozilla, Apple, Microsoft are a little sketchy about this, is that we're not entirely sure that this covers everything and that it covers it well. But you get the idea, right? Like I can define the style sheets I need, the scripts I need. I can define other functions. And then inside my document, I can just pull those in. They all come in at once. Super useful, especially when you start looking at things like, you've got all of this Bootstrap mess just to do a nav bar. And it works, and we can expand it. It's really nice to just have this one document up here instead of having to worry about pasting this big boilerplate and putting it elsewhere, putting things at the top and the bottom of it. Anywho, so the interesting thing about HTML imports is that they give you the ability to access these other resources, be they style sheets, be they script tags, custom element definitions, without having to do JavaScript. So it's all declarative. You say link rel import, provide an HTML file, and that will be available to the document that imported it. You can cache these things because, again, it's an HTTP request. If Bootstrap were to offer something like this on their website and have the correct course headers available, you could do cross-domain loading of these sorts of components. The idea is that this stuff should execute sequentially, but it's a non-blocking load. So kind of similar to putting all of your script tags at the bottom of the page, doing an import. It'll wait for the page to load, then it'll run the things from your imports. And the things that execute in document context. And that's kind of the way HTML imports work. Questions?
If you have, in an HTML import, if you have some HTML content that's not in a template, but just some basic HTML, does that just get rendered once it's loaded? Is it automatic to the page? Or what?
No, it shows up in its own document fragment that you can then go and like use query selector and things like that to find and navigate into and pull it out.
That's probably not how you use it, right?
Yeah.
It seems like the sequential aspect of it eliminates some of the concerns about making it non-blocking, right? I mean, non-blocking just makes sense. You download everything as quickly as you can, and then you still have a known order that things are going to be executed in, right?
Theoretically. But like what would happen if inside this import we also had like a link rel import, foo.html, and you could create cycles.
Yeah.
And then the question is like, you're racing, like which one of these is supposed to run first? Should it be the one that, like, do you do depth first? Do you do breadth first?
Yeah. So
what if you have circular things?
Cycle detection, but like if you're hopefully not, you're going to know you shouldn't do those kinds of things, right? And if you accidentally do, I guess hopefully it would tell you somehow. But most of the time, it's like you just have a dependency tree, right? That makes sense, that doesn't have cycles in it.
Yeah, it's the devil's in the details of like trying to specify it and making sure that that's something that makes sense to implement, especially since like module loading is something that's going to come with ES6. And so one of Mozilla's objections on the mailing list has been that. So I don't actually work on this part of it, so I can't speak authoritatively. But the folks that are participating in those discussions from our side are particularly concerned that if we implement HTML imports natively, one, we think that they're easy to polyfill. Like, we don't think we actually need to build this into the browser yet. But two, if we implement them natively, we'll now have two kind of asynchronous external resource loading subsystems, neither of which are necessarily covering, like, we feel like there should be a way to cover 100% of people's needs instead of having these two kind of half-baked or half-covering systems. So we want to basically say you can polyfill this right now if you want this the way it's spec'd, but we want to wait before we implement something in C++ and then commit to shipping it as part of the web platform forever until ES6 happens, until we can see what people build in terms of module loaders out of that. Semantically, I like it a lot. I would like to see something like this make it into the browser, but at the same time, it's perfectly polyfillable, so Yeah. I ran across a term. Have you guys ever heard the term polyfill?
Probably.
Yeah, it's like we probably will implement this in the future. We hope this is the future of the web. And so a lot of people are talking about the web component stuff in terms of polyfills. Like the concepts, the capabilities that these three specs together give you are something that's clearly lacking in the current web. But how we actually get there is going to be kind of an open question for a while. Anyway, so I talked about really basic stuff like how you can create inert copies of the DOM to reuse it, how you can reference external resources more easily. One of the most fun things about about web components is the idea of custom elements, which is the ability to make your own tags or to extend other tags. And the way this ends up looking is something like this, where you can create. Okay, I'm going to create a my button object, so it's going to descend from HTML button element, and it's as part of its prototype, it's going to have the function who are you, where it alerts that it's one of my buttons, in case I forget. And then I'm going to call this new function document.registerElement, where I provide an element name, and again, any custom element name, the one rule you have to abide by is that it has a dash in it, so that we can kind of namespace custom elements away from native UA provided elements. So this could be my button, it could be your button, it could be, any button. As long as there's a dash, the button part could be whatever either. There's nothing semantic about the name. I'm going to define its prototype as being this. And we're going to claim that it extends the button element. So it'll inherit all the user agent's native behavior for button elements. Like when it's focused, I can hit space to activate it, etc.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
Some of the stuff that you're showing, is some of it supported in Firefox, but some of it's not? Is that?
Yeah. Basically, you can everything in Firefox is behind a flag, dom.components.enabled in about config. The big thing that we have not implemented are things around styling and CSS. So it just doesn't make as good of a demo. We also don't have good support in the dev tools for inspecting Shadow DOM. Chrome's dev tools do a better job of visualizing the Shadow DOM and the Light DOM side by side, whereas we just show the composed tree, which all of that we'll get to in just like 2 minutes. So anyway, so I've defined this my button element. And down here I've got a button B1 and I've got a button B2 that I'm claiming is a my button. And then I'm just going to define some quick handlers to get at those. Sorry, I've skipped this script tag. I also define a xfoo element that has no semantics associated with it, but is a custom element that I can use down here. All right, so if I pop into the browser, this is v1 on custom element. Whoops. I load this up. Again, I've got my little shortcuts, button 1, button 2. Since button 2 is a my button, and since the my button prototype defined other functions on it, on here I can say, who are you? And it alerts. Whereas button 1, which is not being extended, doesn't have that function. So this ability for custom elements to take existing behavior and then add your own kind of scripting interfaces on top of it is super, super powerful. Again, because this is technically a button element, everything that styles buttons will apply to it, everything that interacts with buttons will apply to it. But you can define, like I said, other APIs. So we can say like button 1, who are you? Or button 2 rather. And our custom functionality is available. There's also that xfoo that we created, which is an xfoo tag. It has no behavior associated with it, so it's semantically identical to a div or a span. And in this case, we can look at it and say, like, all right, foo instance of HTML element, true. But as an instance of a div element, no, it's not any of these things. So it's kind of its own thing. You can do your own class selector. The idea behind custom element is that you are able to define APIs like you would expect on like HTML forms. You can check like checkbox.checked. Well, yeah, you could do the same thing on an element that you define. The second thing that custom element lets you do is it lets you define lifecycle callbacks. So I've got an xbar element defined here with a prototype that defines all 4 callbacks that are available: created, attached, detached, and attribute changed. What these callbacks do, created is whenever the element appears in the page for the first time, the created callback will run. Whenever it's attached to the document, the attached callback runs. The detached callback is if you remove it from the document, and then attribute changed takes a callback that gets the name of the element, or the name of the attribute, the old value, the new value. So you can react to how this is being modified. So you can have data attributes that, like, when they change, so does your element. I'll go ahead and register this, provide the prototype, and then I've got this X bar with ID bar and a handle to it. And so in the console, you can see that when we load the page, we see the created and then the attached functions happen, or callbacks happen. But if we say bar dot attributes, so got this name node map. So let's look at ID. We can get that. All right, let's change an attribute. Let's change data what equals that should have fired the callback. All right, let's do this a different way. And so when I change that, you can see attribute changed from null to bar. If I go change that again to Openwest, see attribute foo changed from bar to Openwest. So this gives you the ability to react to two things changing. An example of that would be if I've got this X avatar element, whenever an attribute's changed, if the attribute that changed was called user, then I go and try to request an image. I change the image source, because this descends from HTML image element to avatars user new value.png. So as an example, I can say X avatar user equals Alice. If I go to avatar, I get this. Have you guys seen RoboHash, by the way? This thing's super rad. Takes a string, generates a random robot. Super useful. So I go in here, I can say, all right, instead, let's change this to Bob or Carol. And so every time I do that, this handler that I've defined in my functions, in my custom elements functionality, this attribute change callback, responds to that and rewrites the image source. So you can see, Carol. Do I have a Dave? Yeah. So that's the ability to. So you have the ability to have, again, a much nicer scripting interface where you can just mutate attributes on your element and have the other changes that need to happen flow through automatically. Or at least flow through in a way that's defined much more sanely than any other options that you have. All right.
I have a quick question for you.
Yeah.
I find myself comparing this to Angular directives.
Yes.
Can you, I can't remember what the attribute or keyword was when you customized an element. What was that again? No, with this. Anyway, can you add like multiple, what is the terminology called? So when you, instead of creating an entirely new custom element, version 1, I think, on the
Right.
second button there, right?
It is something else?
Yeah, is something else.
Right.
Can it be is like multiple different components?
Mix-ins, right?
Yeah. I believe so. I'm not sure.
I guess is that in the
This-
idea of this? Is that kind of going
Yes.
that way?
There is definitely a notion of mix-in. When you, let's see, MDN.
Or is it just restricted to a single variation of that?
I believe when you register the element itself can, maybe not. There is a notion of mix-ins. I'm not sure where it is in the spec or implementation
How
stage.
about, is there a possibility to communicate from like one to another through the?
I mean, you have access
Like
to.
check, or
Yeah.
radio buttons, there's multiple of them and they communicate with each other. When one's changed, the other's clear.
There is the ability to, I mean, you can write arbitrary JavaScript, but you'd have to kind of hand roll that. There isn't a native ability for the buttons to
Communicate or
see like other parts of their group or something like that. You'd have to go and say, all right, like walk up the DOM tree, find my parent, or find all the things that have the same grouping ID,
yeah.
and then kind of manually handle that whenever something changes, which is, again, like why we have things like Angular and other frameworks. We're really trying to provide like the raw primitives that people can build those abstractions on top of.
I just see something like the Angular directives just kind of using a lot of this, instead of its own.
Yeah, I know that at least the Ember community wants to start using custom element for some of their widgets.
As I understand it, Angular version 2 is using this going straight to web component.
Oh, that's doing it as well? Rad.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, I haven't looked too much at Angular too, so is that
That's what
Pretty
I
sure?
hear. I'm not using it much because I'm using Polymer instead
Mhm.
of Angular.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah, the developer spec for Angular was released last week, so you can see Angular.
Okay.
You can see it is using web components, but with Angular's flavor of it.
Right. So anyways, so you can create elements. The elements can either be their own or they can extend to other elements. You have callbacks to manage the whole lifecycle of when it shows up in the DOM, when it goes away, when things change. There's a new CSS pseudo selector, unresolved, which is if the browser encounters an element that it has not seen a document.register element call for, like if it doesn't have a definition for it yet, those should be selected by the unresolved pseudo class. And the idea there is that you can hide things until the implementation has been loaded. You can say, all right, well, if it's unresolved, display none. And then when it comes into being, when it's actually has the behavior that you've defined, that selector falls off. But this doesn't solve encapsulations. Like we saw with the avatar example, right? That I can still see in here, and I can still see that under the cover, this is really just something wrapping an image tag. So even though I only wrote X avatar whatever, in my implementation, when this gets attached to the DOM, I create an image tag, I set its source, and I append it to my X avatar element. In some cases, this is totally fine, but sometimes you want to hide this. You don't want people to see the implementation detail, right? So like say you've got an image carousel. You might want to have an X carousel with like slide, slide, slide as 3 elements. And that's cool, but you don't want people to be able to expand this and also see the other 3 like image tags for the back, forward, pause, right? And that's super useful for selecting because, you know, if you, in the carousel idea, were to go and say document.querySelectorAll, carousel, descendants, image tag, you would pick up not only your slides, but also the implementation things, and it wouldn't be obvious from your HTML. Shadow DOM gives us a way to take the stuff that's there for display purposes and hide it. So you can take semantically meaningless markup, put it somewhere else, and also control how style sheets interact with things in the Shadow DOM. That second part, massively underspecified right now. Google submitted Google's implementation of web components has the ability to say select this and then use /deep/ to pierce into Shadow DOM and then change other things. And Google themselves have described it as a gigantic foot gun. So how styling interacts with Shadow DOM, is living on the edge, man. So demos, Shadow DOM demos. Let's look at this. Let's look at that avatar example. And instead of attaching this image tag we create to the X avatar document, we changed 2 items. One, we said, all right, on the X avatar, call create shadow root. And then we want to put this image tag in, call root append child, and put it inside the shadow root instead of just inside the X avatar. Same thing when the name changes. Instead of appending it to down here, we just again, go inside the X avatar image or X avatar element, look for the image tag and change it. If we're doing Shadow DOM, we have to look for, all right, inside the X avatar, inside the shadow root, then do the query selector. And what this ends up looking like is, again, the same sort of thing where I can change this to Bob and it works, or Carol. But if I try to go and say document.querySelectorAll, and I try to get all of the images on the page, I get nothing because that image tag is actually inside the shadow root down there. So again, anything inside the shadow root, you're not going to be able to query into it. You're not going to be able to see it when you look for stuff. And so an example of how this could be useful is which directory was it in? Oh, it's back here. So if you go and look at Gmail and look at the Google Hangouts, Zoom, you have this enormous mess of divs with a hilarious number of classes on them. What you could do instead, if you had custom element and Shadow DOM, and like these are there for good reasons, because you have to have certain nesting, you have to have certain abilities to apply styles at certain areas. If you had custom element and Shadow DOM, you could instead have both a scripting interface and an authoring interface that would look something more like that, where you have semantic things like Hangout module, Hangout chat from Paul and Addie, Hangout discussion, Hangout message. And behind the scenes, all of this is implemented with that same enormous rat's nest of divs, but you don't see it when you view source, and you don't see it when you are navigating through the document with JavaScript. let's take a quick detour into what Shadow DOM actually does. So simple document, I've got a header with two H1 or an H1 and H2 tag, and I've just gone and selected this header document. So if I look at this, Shadow V1, right, makes sense. Nothing crazy going on here. What the Shadow DOM does is it basically, I have a normal DOM tree, header, H1, H2. And the browser's rendering that just like you would expect it to. If I say header, what do I call it, H? If I say H dot create shadow root, SR equals, immediately that stuff disappeared and I got back a handle to a shadow root. Everything is still in the DOM in the same order, H1, H2, shadow root. But whenever the browser sees a node with a shadow root, it says, all right, I'm going to stop rendering what I see, and I'm going to go into the shadow root and render what's there. And right now, we don't have anything there. Our shadow root.innerHTML is empty. But I could change that to, foo, and that shows up. If I go and say document, or if I say header.innerHTML, or h dot, I still see my H1, H2. If I say document.querySelector, all H1, I still see that H1. Does this make sense? Shadow root basically obliterates, says like, all right, browser, there's stuff here, JavaScript still sees it, but I don't want you to render it. I want you to render the things in the shadow root instead. Does that make sense to people? Cool. So the cool thing about the shadow root is that you have this tag called content, where you can say content, and it basically goes and pulls things from your DOM, from your normal DOM, and places them in that point inside the shadow root. And so you can actually change this to say select H1. Whoops, quotes. And you can provide CSS selectors, and it will only pull the content matching that selector from that node. So we can use this ability to actually flip the order of these headers. So I can first select the H2, then select the H1, and it flips them over. Because the shadow root is basically defining, like, here's my presentational markup, and you can pull in your structural markup from your normal DOM into that in different slots by having these content tags. Does that make sense to people? Questions?
So we're looking at a real-world implementation. It would be more or less throw the content we want to display on the page, but then go into the shadow root and just pull out individual components depending on whatever else.
Exactly.
So on this example, that select attribute, can that be a more complex query than just, I'm trying to remember what you did in the original inner HTML there. Is that just an H1 tag, or
Oops.
did it have a ID named H1? How did?
No, just had two, an H1 and
If there
H2.
had been two H1s in there, what would have happened?
Oh, it would have pulled them both. So it's a CSS query, so you can match it. You can also say like first child or whatever, nth child.
And
Do
you would
that.
have done an ID instead if you wanted.
Absolutely.
Okay, cool.
So the interesting thing about it, like if you don't have that select attribute, it just grabs whatever is left over, whatever hasn't been selected. So if I change this back to the selecting H2, and instead of selecting H1, I just say, all right, give me everything else. Again, we get the same result. If I flip this and say select H1, it goes back to that.
Oh, it pulls them out.
It actually pulls them out.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And so what's interesting is that I can't, let's see, select equals. It can only pull things one time. So even though I say select H2 twice, you only see it appear once because it's only there once in the actual like light DOM, the normal DOM tree. This takes a while to understand because like the things in your shadow root can also have shadow roots themselves. Again, last month we got rid of the ability for things to have multiple shadow roots at the same level, thank God. But But things are super, super bizarre there. But it still gives you a lot of ability to hide presentational markup. So I could say what I really want to have happen is I want my H2 to be surrounded in a span class equals, or span style equals color red. Span. And so I can add other markup. I can add other HTML, other elements inside there. Kind of cool. Let you keep semantic HTML for scripting interfaces and for authoring interfaces, and then have this separate place where you put things that are super presentational. Native browser UI components. So like the video tag has a little scrubber and the play pause button. Most browsers actually implement it using Shadow DOM. It's just not visible to you when you inspect it. Same sort of idea. Like you have a video tag, you have sources. We're going to take that, then we're also going to add in some image tags to represent the different player controls. We are ever so slightly over time. The idea of Shadow DOM, you have encapsulation, you can reorder content. The host selector may or may not exist in the near future to let you add style sheets that touch the whole Shadow DOM, and it kind of gives you a boundary. Whoops. Further reading, I'll tweet out links. There are a bunch of libraries. The big one is Polymer and the webcomponents.js polyfill. There's a great website, customelements.io, that has a huge index of cool things. You can look at HTML5 Rocks for great articles on how to use this. And I don't have time for questions, but I do have time to show you the xgif tag, which is the best possible tag, because you can say xgif, give it a source image, works. But you can also give it attributes like ping pong, and it actually plays back and forth, or run it in times, or speed equals whatever. And so behind the scenes, what this is doing is it has implementations that say, all right, when I see this attribute, actually cycle the images faster, or at a certain beats per minute, or synced to audio. Like absolutely insane stuff. Again, done with custom element, done with Shadow DOM. We can look inside this and see what it's actually doing is it's got all the images, all the frames, and it's just dramatically changing, like at the right rate, which frame is displayed. But if you look at the markup, you don't see any of that. So that's custom element and Shadow DOM and template and HTML import. They're all coming sometime. I thought it would have been by now. I apologize. But if you have questions or want to talk more, again, the joined in link is 13.923, and I'll be outside. So thank you all so much.